When Ellen mocked Keanu Reeves live on national TV, the world laughed. Except him. He didn't clap back, didn't storm off. He just looked at her. What followed wasn't a meltdown, it was a moment that would leave millions speechless, and Ellen forever changed. But to understand why, we have to start 2 days before the cameras rolled. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was only 30 seconds long. That was all the world saw at first, a single clip, uploaded from someone's phone in the studio audience, grainy and shaky, but clear enough to show what happened. Ellen DeGeneres leaned forward in her chair, microphone in hand, grinning at the man beside her. Her voice was playful, practiced, coated in sarcasm the way TV hosts often dress cruelty and charm. "Keanu," she said, flashing her trademark smile, "do you do anything besides brood?" The audience burst into laughter. The kind of laughter that rolls out automatically, more from habit than humor. People laughed because they thought they were supposed to. A few even clapped. Someone whistled. But Keanu Reeves didn't move. He didn't laugh, didn't look down, didn't play along. He just looked at her. Quietly. Like he had heard this joke before, not once, but 1,000 times. And each time, it wore the same mask. His gaze didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It simply held, like the eye of a storm. Still, clear, unmoved. Then the clip cut out. That was all it took. By midnight, the moment had gone viral. Within 24 hours, it had been shared across every platform, captioned in dozens of languages. Keanu goes cold on Ellen. The brooding silence. Best response to a talk show insult ever. Some took Ellen's side. It was just a joke, they said. He needs to lighten up. Others pushed back hard. He didn't need to say a word. That look said everything. But beneath the surface-level takes and comment wars, a quieter question began to emerge. A single sentence whispered between reposts and reactions. What really happened that day? To answer that, you'd have to go back. Not to the moment Ellen mocked him, but to the beginning. The real beginning. 2 days earlier, east side of Los Angeles, a late afternoon sun stretching shadows across sidewalk tables, and Keanu sitting alone. He was at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, the kind of place where people mind their own business and baristas memorize regulars' orders without ever asking their names. Keanu had chosen the corner seat, as always. No sunglasses, no hat, no security. Just a man in a dark coat, quietly tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. In his hands were two things: a notebook, leather-bound, edges worn soft by years of being opened and closed, and a photograph. Black and white, a rooftop in New York 20 years ago, two people smiling into the sun. Him and a woman, with wind in her hair and a laugh frozen in stillness. He held the picture carefully, not like it was fragile, but like it was sacred. Then the footsteps came. They were hesitant at first. Light, careful. A woman approached, mid-30s, holding a clipboard and a headset. She looked like someone used to giving orders, but unsure how to speak to the man in front of her. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly. He looked up, not startled, just present. The woman adjusted her headset and gave a small, respectful nod. "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name's Dana. I work with The Ellen Show." Keanu said nothing at first, just closed the notebook gently and placed the photograph inside, careful not to crease it. Then he looked at her again, waiting. "They're doing a segment this week," Dana continued, her voice more tentative now. "It's called Kindness Unfiltered. They want to highlight people who embody compassion in a world that feels noisy." She hesitated, then added, "Your name was the first on everyone's list." Keanu didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted, just slightly. Dana wasn't sure if it was curiosity or warning. "Look," she said quickly, "I know you don't really do daytime talk shows. We're not expecting a performance. We just thought it might be a good reminder. You know, for the audience. For the world." She didn't mention the ratings, or the fact that Ellen's team had pitched this segment specifically to counter declining viewership with something emotional and digestible. She didn't mention that they'd already planned a few personal questions, just enough to crack his calm exterior for the camera. Keanu looked down at the table. His fingers tapped once, then stilled. "Kindness doesn't need a stage," he said. Dana swallowed, unsure if that was a rejection. Then he looked up again, eyes calm, voice even. "But sometimes the world needs a reminder." Dana nodded quickly, trying not to look too relieved. "We'll send a car," she said. "Tuesday, noon taping." He didn't respond. He just opened the notebook again, turned a page and began to write. Dana backed away slowly. She didn't know what he was writing. Didn't ask. She wouldn't have understood, even if she had. But the moment she left that cafe, she pulled out her phone and called the producers. "Listen," she whispered. Back inside, Keanu paused his pen. He took the photo out again, placed it in front of him, and stared at it in silence. There was a story in that photo no one had ever asked about, a grief he'd never turned into content, a memory untouched by fame. That night, he returned home without telling anyone about the upcoming appearance. Not his agent, not his assistant, not his friends. Just another evening, another late meal, another few quiet hours before sleep. Across town, Ellen's team was rehearsing lines. "We'll start with a joke," her producer said, "then pivot into emotion." Ellen shrugged. "What kind of joke?" One of the interns smirked. "Call him Hollywood's saddest action star." The room laughed. Ellen chuckled too. "All right, let's see if we can get the Buddha to blink." In her mind, it was just another segment, just another name. But 2 days later, when Keanu Reeves walked through the doors of that studio, the air changed. Not because he said anything, but because he didn't need to. Tuesday came quietly. No fanfare, no handlers. Keanu arrived at the studio in his own car, a gray, nondescript sedan with a faint rattle in the door when it closed. He parked in the guest section, nodded politely to the parking attendant, who almost dropped his coffee cup in surprise, and walked toward the side entrance with his hands in his coat pockets. The sun was strong that day, but the air was cool. He liked days like that, when the world felt both alive and subdued. He moved slowly, deliberately, not because he was tired, but because he always walked like the ground mattered. Inside the studio, things were louder. Lights buzzed overhead. Assistants scurried past each other with clipboards, cables, and the subtle panic of live television prep. There were reminders everywhere, cue cards being printed, joke drafts being rewritten, hair and makeup stations humming under rows of bulbs. But Keanu bypassed most of it. He was escorted straight to a small dressing room marked Guest A. He stepped inside and took a seat near the mirror, but didn't face it. A young stylist appeared minutes later with a rack of outfits, nothing extravagant but flashier than what he had on. Lighter tones, more tailored fits. "Something a little more camera-friendly," she offered, smiling nervously. Keanu looked at the rack, then at his own reflection, then back at the stylist. "I'm not here to decorate your ratings," he said gently. The stylist hesitated, then gave a small bow of the head. "Of course." He stayed in what he came in: charcoal blazer, black jeans, soft boots with worn heels. The silver ring on his right hand caught the light briefly as he adjusted the sleeves. He didn't check his phone, didn't scroll through headlines or prep lines or rehearse sound bites. Instead, he opened the notebook again. On the page were 3 words: "Be exactly present." Backstage, Ellen's team huddled. Her producer handed her a revised list of prompts. Push the loneliness angle, ask about the house, the ring, maybe even the funeral. Ellen raised an eyebrow. That's a little dark for daytime, don't you think? The intern leaned in. People love to see gods bleed. Ellen laughed softly. And they love me for drawing the first cut. A stagehand called out from the wings. 2 minutes! Keanu closed the notebook, slipped the photo back inside, stood up and rolled his shoulders once, slow and quiet. The hallway to the stage was dim, lit only by floor lights and the echo of muffled applause as the warm-up comic finished their bit. Keanu walked it alone. No entourage, no script, just the soft thud of his boots on the studio floor. And then the lights flared bright, the music kicked in, the applause roared like a wave trying to swallow him whole. Keanu stepped onto the stage, still, unshakable. And as he sat in the guest chair, across from one of the most polished performers in television history, the audience leaned forward, sensing, perhaps before they understood it, that this was not going to be the segment anyone expected. Not for Ellen, not for Keanu, and not for the millions about to watch the storm arrive. The dressing room was quiet, not empty, just quiet, in the way a room becomes when someone brings silence with them. Keanu Reeves sat in the center of it, legs crossed, palms resting loosely on his knees. He hadn't touched the water bottle on the table, hadn't glanced at the mirror, hadn't reached for a phone. His eyes were open, steady, but they didn't dart. They didn't scan. They simply rested, like his body knew how to be still in a way few people in this industry remembered. A knock came at the door. Then it opened without waiting. The stylist stepped back in, hopeful but cautious. "Mr. Reeves," she said, holding a navy blue blazer. "The director just thought maybe—" Keanu looked at her gently, and though he said nothing yet, the pause said enough. She trailed off. "It's not personal," he said softly. "But I didn't come here to be tailored." Her hands lowered the hanger. She gave him a tight smile, nodded, and left. He remained in what he wore, his old charcoal blazer, softened from years of use, with faint wear on the cuffs. The boots were scuffed but clean, the jeans black and simple. The only shimmer was the silver ring on his right hand, dulled not by neglect, but time. He had worn it every day since the funeral. On the other side of the building, the energy was louder, brighter, controlled chaos. The writers huddled around Ellen's assistant, reviewing last-minute cue cards. A producer ran down the checklist with the director. Hair, sound, lights, camera angles. The urgency was rehearsed, like everything else. But the nervous edge was real. "Here's the revised lineup," said one of the senior producers. "Start light, then pivot. Bring up the loneliness early. Mention the apartment, the dog if needed." An intern nearby, still young enough to blush at controversy, furrowed his brow. "Isn't that a little harsh?" he asked. The producer glanced sideways. No one tunes in for small talk. They want depth, but only if it bleeds. Another voice chimed in, this time from Ellen herself. She was sitting cross-legged on her office couch, reading a card with a joke scribbled across it. "Let's see what sadness sells today," she said dryly, tossing the card onto the table. "But keep the tempo. We lose them if it feels like therapy." The staff laughed, some of them nervously, some of them not at all. A junior segment coordinator walked by the green room on her way to deliver props. She slowed down for just a second, peeking through the glass panel on the door. Inside, Keanu hadn't moved. No TV, no music, no scrolling. Just stillness. She paused long enough to whisper under her breath, "He's different." Then she kept walking. Back in the green room, Keanu remained seated, his back straight but relaxed. He wasn't meditating, he wasn't rehearsing. He was simply present. The notebook was closed on the table beside him. The photograph remained tucked inside, close to him, but hidden from view. He didn't need to look at it. It lived in his memory like a steady flame, never demanding but never extinguished. Outside the door, footsteps passed now and then, rushed, loud, Some paused, some didn't. But no one disturbed him. Not because he was unapproachable, but because something about his silence felt sacred, like knocking would be an intrusion into a space that wasn't theirs to enter. Backstage, Ellen stood near the curtain, going over her opening line with the stage manager. "Don't forget the audience cue," the manager reminded her. "We want them standing before he gets to the chair." Ellen smirked. "They'll stand. Everyone loves a mystery." She flipped through the prompt cards again. One of them had a handwritten note in red ink at the top. "Push the contrast. Private, Viz performant." Another said, "Ask why he never shows emotion." She read it aloud in a dry, sarcastic tone. "Never shows emotion? That man is emotion. He just doesn't perform it loud enough for ratings." A few chuckles followed. The control room voice cut in over the earpiece. "Remember to keep the rhythm. Joke, pause, pivot. Don't linger too long in the heavy stuff or we'll lose the segment transitions." Ellen rolled her eyes. "It's Keanu Reeves. If we lose transitions, we just stare at him brooding and call it a cinematic moment." Laughter erupted again, but it didn't last long. Another staffer stepped into the room with a final script update. "Got the new cue. We're starting with the sad legend line." The test audience laughed hardest at that. Ellen nodded, pulling her blazer sleeves into place. "Let's wake up the world." Just down the hallway, Keanu stood slowly. Not stiffly, not dramatically, just like someone who had decided it was time to move. He stepped toward the door, opened it himself, and walked out without saying a word. An assistant tried to catch up to him holding a tablet. "Mr. Reeves," just a quick glance at the segment flow. He raised a hand gently. "No need. I'm not here to follow a flowchart." The assistant stopped in his tracks. Not offended, just quieted. The energy Keanu carried was not combative, but final. Not sharp, but deeply rooted, like a tree that doesn't need to announce its strength. As he approached the curtain, a sound technician adjusted the mic pack on his back. Keanu didn't flinch. Behind the curtain, the audience was buzzing. Music was playing, the warm-up comic had finished his set, and the lights dimmed in preparation. A production assistant whispered into a headset. "Guest is in place." "Copy," came the voice from control. "Stand by. Cue lights." The floor manager gave the countdown silently, with raised fingers. 3, 2, 1. The stage lights burst to life. The intro music rolled in, a polished, upbeat theme meant to carry momentum. The kind of sound that demands a smile even if your heart's not ready for one. The camera panned to Ellen as she stepped into frame, all brightness and rhythm, a veteran performer at ease in her arena. She greeted the audience with her usual flair, dropping 2 quick jokes, eliciting a ripple of laughter. Her timing, as always, was immaculate. But beneath the surface, there was tension in her shoulders, a flicker of unease she hadn't quite identified yet. Maybe it was because she didn't know what Keanu would do. Maybe it was because a part of her already knew this would not be the usual ride. "And now," she said, grinning toward the camera, "the man who turned silence into a brand and brooding into box office gold, please welcome Keanu Reeves." The crowd exploded into applause. Some people jumped to their feet without thinking. Others followed out of instinct. What they weren't doing, however, was screaming. There was excitement, yes, but it was hushed, respectful, as if they all collectively sensed this wasn't the moment to be loud. Keanu walked onto the stage, his pace even. He gave a small wave, not to perform, but to acknowledge. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, not guarded, not performative, just steady. He shook Ellen's hand with a simple nod and took his seat. The applause slowly faded as the music dropped out. Ellen leaned forward, her eyes bright. Her first line was already loaded on the teleprompter. She chose not to read it. Instead, she tried something else, something sharper. "You know," she said with a mock-serious face, "you might be Hollywood's most mysterious legend, or maybe just its most boring." A beat. The crowd chuckled, unsure if it was okay. A few laughed harder, waiting for a punchline. Keanu didn't blink. He looked at her. Not with offense, not with humor, just quiet attention. The same way someone might watch clouds gather in the distance. Calm, patient, knowing. And in that moment, even before he spoke a word, the tone of the room began to shift. Because kindness had never been a costume for him. Not a mask he wore to gain approval. Not a gimmick to clean up a reputation. It wasn't branded or stylized or tweeted out for applause. It was part of him, woven into his silence, stitched into the pauses between his words. And though Ellen hadn't seen it yet, the storm she'd casually summoned with a joke was already unfolding. Not with thunder or fury, but with something far more unsettling to the world of scripted television. Truth. Unarmed, unapologetic, and finally, undeniable. Ellen's smile stretched wide as the applause faded. Her eyes, however, sharpened as they met Keanu's. She leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, playing the part of the relaxed host. But the moment already felt different. The kind of difference seasoned hosts notice instinctively. The silence that doesn't beg to be filled, but dares you to sit in it. She cleared her throat and went for it. "Well, here he is," she said brightly, with a grin that didn't reach her eyes. "The saddest man in Hollywood." There was a flicker of nervous laughter from the audience, not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that asks permission to keep going. A few clapped. A few glanced around, unsure. Keanu smiled, softly, not defensive, not sarcastic, just the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Then, with a calm that seemed to stretch across the entire studio, he said, "Thank you for having me." His voice was low and even, like smooth water over stone. It didn't push, it didn't resist. It simply existed. Ellen paused, perhaps expecting more. A comeback, a self-deprecating punchline, something viral. But he gave her nothing except sincerity. She tried again, switching tactics. "So," she said, tilting her head, "you're known for being private, quiet, mysterious. You don't post. You don't overshare. In a world full of influencers, don't you think that makes you a little irrelevant?" The jab was sharp, wrapped in sugar. Her smile never faded. But the audience felt it. There was a moment of discomfort. Someone coughed. A woman near the front row shifted in her seat. Keanu leaned forward slightly, not to attack, but to meet the moment. "Relevance," he said, "is just popularity wearing a mask." He let that land, not as a punch, as a truth. "I'm not interested in masks." The room went still. A sound tech at the side of the stage stopped adjusting his mic pack. A camera operator instinctively zoomed in tighter on Keanu's face. Ellen blinked. She laughed, too loudly. Okay, we're getting deep early." A few scattered laughs followed, but they were thinner now. She tried to bring it back. "Let's talk about your lifestyle. No mansion, no chef, no luxury cars. You still live alone in that tiny apartment, right?" Keanu didn't flinch. "I live where I feel peace." "But come on," she pressed, smiling wider now. "You're a global movie star. Don't you think you've earned a little more glamour?" He paused. His eyes didn't waver. "Sometimes," he said, "the most glamorous thing you can do is live without pretending." The audience was no longer laughing. They were listening. The atmosphere in the studio had begun to change. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. The audience leaned forward, some with their hands clasped in their laps. A few lowered their phones, no longer recording. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else. Ellen kept smiling, but it had lost its edge. She crossed her legs the other way and tried to keep the pace lively. Okay, she said, holding up her hands. "So no private jets, no gold statues, no champagne fountains. You really are the anti-celebrity." I don't think of myself that way, Keanu replied. I just try not to forget who I was before the noise. Ellen nodded slowly. And who was that? A boy who thought he had to earn love by staying out of the way, he said without hesitation. That line stopped everything. There was no dramatic pause, no tearful confession, just a quiet sentence dropped into the middle of a bright, polished stage. Ellen hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. She looked down at the next card in her lap, but the words there suddenly felt flat. Your fans, she said, improvising now, they want to see you happy, smiling, confident. Don't you think they deserve that? Keanu turned his gaze to her. Not sharp, but direct. The Ethiopian said, they don't need me to perform happiness, he said. They need me to be real, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is show up exactly as you are, no matter how unpolished, no matter how broken. A woman in the third row gasped softly, not out of shock, but out of recognition. One of the interns standing by the curtain whispered to a cameraman, he's not answering her questions, he's rewriting them. And it was true. Keanu wasn't giving her what she asked for. He was giving her what she, and the world, didn't realize it needed. Ellen tried to retake control. But isn't there a risk in being that honest? She asked. Aren't you afraid of being misunderstood? He tilted his head slightly. Silence is often misunderstood, but so is every truth that matters. The room held its breath. No one was laughing anymore. The applause sign had been off for minutes, but it wouldn't have mattered. No one would have obeyed it. The control room team looked at each other. The segment was veering off script and fast, but none of them were reaching for a fix. They were watching too. Ellen cleared her throat. You're different than I expected. Keanu didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, his presence unmoved, his voice calm. And you're not performing today, she said. No, he said gently. I'm not. Ellen sat back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger but in calculation. For years, she had mastered the rhythm of interviews, the pauses, the beats, the laughter. But with Keanu, every familiar cue seemed to disappear. The more she leaned into spectacle, the more he answered with stillness, not rebellion, just truth. She decided to push a little harder. You once said grief doesn't end, she said, her voice taking a softer turn, that it just changes shape. Do you really believe that? Yes, Keanu said, without hesitation. Because love doesn't end either. The words weren't dramatic, they were quiet, but they landed like a bell tolling in the center of the room. Ellen glanced at her next card, but her fingers didn't move to flip it. She didn't know why, but something in her couldn't break the silence just yet. Keanu added, People think sadness is something you get over, like a cold, but some things aren't meant to be cured. Some things are meant to be carried. From the second row, a man in a crisp business suit took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. Behind him, a young woman placed her hand gently over her chest. The audience wasn't performing either. Ellen tried to pivot. She reached for levity. So, no fancy lifestyle, no social media. You don't seem to care what people think. I care deeply, Keanu said, just not about applause. There it was again. The stillness. Not confrontational, not aloof, but centered. Ellen tried to smile, but it came out uneven. She looked at him for a long second. Why come on the show then, she asked, if you're not here to entertain? Keanu's answer came softly, but without apology. Because you have a platform, he said. And some people watching this, they're tired of pretending to be okay. I just wanted them to know they're not alone. Ellen blinked. The card in her hand slipped slightly. She didn't pick it up. She looked out at the audience. Not a single person was on their phone now. Not a single cough. Just the breath of the room, synchronized in quiet attention. Keanu leaned back slightly. Not to rest, just to allow space. "I've spent most of my life in rooms full of people who love noise," he said, "but I've never met anyone whose soul needed more of it." The stage lights seemed dimmer now, or maybe the glare of performance was finally fading. Ellen lowered her hand and placed the card on her lap. She looked at him, not as a host, not as a performer, but for the first time, as someone seeing the person in front of her without the frame of the show. "I wasn't ready for this," she said quietly. "Neither was I," Keanu answered, "but that doesn't mean we didn't need it." And just like that, the segment was no longer about headlines or laughter. It had become a moment, one that would echo far beyond the studio walls. Ellen sat up straighter in her chair, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. Her face held a smile, but her eyes had narrowed ever so slightly. She was used to guiding interviews, used to laughter, punctuating the moments between questions. But with Keanu, the rhythm had changed. The laughs weren't landing, and the applause was no longer automatic. She glanced at one of her remaining cards and tried a new angle. If empathy wasn't working, maybe contrast would. "So, no entourage?" she said casually. "No chef, no assistants waiting on you at home? Still living in that apartment with the creaky radiator?" There were a few chuckles in the crowd. It was meant to be light, maybe even self-deprecating, but it didn't land. Keanu nodded once, his posture unchanged. "It's quiet there," he said. "I like quiet." Ellen pushed further. "But don't you ever wonder if that's settling? You're one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Isn't living that small kind of a failure?" The air changed. No one gasped, but no one laughed either. Keanu didn't blink. He didn't fidget or even shift in his seat. He just let the question hang there for a moment, then answered with a calm that was somehow louder than anger. "Success," he said, "is sitting in silence and feeling no shame." A pause followed, not for effect, for truth, and the audience felt it. Somewhere in the back row, a woman lowered her phone. She had been recording, but now she wasn't sure why. A young man in the front row who had laughed along at the earlier jokes now sat with his arms crossed, nodding slightly, his face unreadable. Backstage, a camera operator leaned toward his colleague. "We're not filming a show anymore," he whispered. "We're filming a moment." On stage, Ellen adjusted in her seat, visibly unsettled. She had spent decades mastering the arc of the segment. Setup, joke, pivot, emotional beat, commercial. But nothing about this was following the arc. And the control she normally held in her fingertips was slipping. She tried to steer things back. "Well, your fans love you, whether you want to believe it or not," she said quickly. "They just want to celebrate you. Give them something big, a story, something glamorous." Keanu looked at her gently, as if trying to understand why she kept reaching for glitter in a room already full of gold. "Baby don't need big," he said. "They need real." The room fell into silence again, this time deeper than before. Real. That word echoed in the minds of everyone watching. And somewhere between the lights and the cameras, something shifted. Not just in the show, but in the people present. Not because Keanu had said something shocking, but because he hadn't performed at all. Ellen uncrossed her legs and recrossed them the other way. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to most, but those watching closely could see it for what it was: discomfort. The control she usually had over a segment, over a guest, over the room, was slipping like sand through her fingers. Her smile was still there, but it flickered around the edges now. She glanced at the next cue card, but didn't read it. It no longer felt useful. Instead, she folded her hands together and leaned slightly forward. "Real is fine," she said, "but this is television. People tune in to escape. They want the big stories, the dream houses, the private islands. You don't think they deserve a little fantasy?" Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Devilly deserve honesty," he said. The audience shifted again. You could feel it now, the slow unraveling of performance. The tension between what was expected and what was actually happening. No one had moved in minutes, but everyone felt like they had. He continued, not hurried, not rehearsed. If all we show people is fantasy, they forget how to live their own lives. They start believing small is failure, that quiet is weakness, that if they're not impressive, they're invisible. Ellen opened her mouth to reply, but he kept going, not interrupting, just finishing what needed to be said. But I've seen more truth in a diner at midnight than in most boardrooms. I've seen more love in a subway than at red carpet premieres. The places we think don't matter, those are the places where people survive, where they endure. The room was breathless now. No cue, no applause sign, just stillness. Ellen sat back, her face unreadable for a moment. She seemed to be searching for her next move, but none of the usual moves felt right. "So you don't think we should aim for more?" she asked. Keanu shook his head. "I think we should redefine what more means." He paused again, then added gently, "Sometimes more isn't louder or flashier. Sometimes more is just being fully present with another person, without needing to impress them, without needing to prove anything." A soft exhale came from someone in the audience, not staged, just a human reaction. Behind the cameras, a producer leaned back in his chair and whispered to the audio tech beside him, "We're losing the script." The tech didn't look away from the monitor. "No," he said, "we're losing the noise." Ellen's smile faded into something quieter now. Not defeat, not performance, just something closer to human. "You really believe people want that?" she asked. "The real stuff? The quiet stuff?" Keanu nodded. "I think they're starving for it." And in that moment, everyone in the room knew he was right. Because for the first time in a long time, no one wanted to laugh. No one needed to be entertained. They just needed to feel. Ellen looked out at the audience, then back at Keanu. She opened her mouth again, then paused, visibly weighing whether to press forward or surrender to the silence. For years, she had built a career on making people laugh, keeping things light, entertaining. But now, every tool she normally used felt brittle. "This isn't what we planned," she finally said, half laughing, though it didn't carry the usual lift. "We had a whole segment laid out, games, jokes, some rapid-fire questions. And instead, we're sitting in silence." Keanu smiled softly, not smugly. Sometimes silence says more than sound ever could. It wasn't meant as a jab. It was simply true. And it landed in the center of the room like a still pond. No splash, just ripple after ripple, moving outward. One woman in the third row wiped a tear from her cheek. She wasn't sure why. Nothing had been said to her directly, but something inside her had been heard anyway. Ellen sat back in her chair, visibly affected now. She looked down at the cards in her hand and slowly slid them beneath her thigh, as if even touching them made her feel disconnected from what was happening. "Do you ever think about legacy?" she asked, not reading from anything now. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor for a moment, then met her gaze. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind," he said. "It's what you give while you're here. It's what people carry long after you've left the room." "And what do you think you're giving right now?" she asked, almost whispering. He paused again. "Permission." She blinked. "Permission for what?" "To stop pretending," he said. "To stop performing. To be exactly who they are, even if it doesn't shine under studio lights." The audience didn't applaud. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because no one wanted to break the moment. It felt fragile. Backstage, someone in the control room leaned forward and whispered, "He's flipping the entire segment without raising his voice." Another producer murmured, "He's not flipping it, he's rewiring it." Ellen exhaled, almost like she'd been holding her breath since the interview started. She looked at Keanu, not as an interviewer, not as a performer, but as someone who had just been reminded of something she didn't know she had forgotten. "You know," she said softly. "This might be the quietest interview I've ever done." Keanu offered a small nod. "Then maybe it's the loudest thing I've said in years." That was when the first full wave of emotion passed through the audience. Not tears, not gasps, just presence. Hundreds of people, for the first time in a long time, feeling not like an audience, but like people, real people. And Keanu, the man who had lost everything and chosen not to lose his peace, had led them there without ever raising his voice. Backstage, the control room was unraveling. What had started as a high-energy segment was now drifting so far from the script that the producers didn't know how to pull it back. One of them leaned into the headset and whispered urgently, "We need to cut to commercial." Another voice responded, "We're not at a logical break. If we cut now, it'll look like panic." "Because it is," the first one snapped. "She's losing control of the segment." But the director said nothing. His eyes stayed on the monitor, watching the stage, watching Keanu. On the studio floor, Ellen cleared her throat again. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't cracking jokes anymore, but she wasn't ready to surrender either. She forced a half smile and leaned forward. "Well," she said, trying to lift the mood, "your fans still love the magic. They want something to dream about, something big. You're a star, after all. Isn't that what you're supposed to give them?" Keanu didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they're trying to listen to something most people can't hear. Then he said, "Sometimes the most glamorous thing you can be is exactly who you are." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't dress it up in performance. He just let it be. And the words echoed in the room in a way no joke ever could. In the third row, a woman covered her mouth with her hand and began to cry. Not loudly, just tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't know why it hit her. Maybe it was the way he said it. Or maybe it was how long it had been since she had allowed herself to believe that was enough. 2 rows behind her, a teenage boy stared at the stage, his phone still in his hand, the screen dim. He had started the recording, like everyone else. But he had stopped watching the phone 10 minutes ago. He wasn't even aware he was still holding it. The room wasn't quiet because it had to be. It was quiet because it wanted to be. Because in the middle of a world built on noise, this man had offered something most people had forgotten how to receive: stillness. And the audience responded not with applause or cheers, but with attention, with presence. Without warning, the studio lights dimmed slightly. A technician later said it was an electrical glitch. Another swore someone backstage hit the wrong switch. But no one really believed that. The change felt too organic, too perfectly timed. The light softened. The air grew heavier, like the space itself had changed. And suddenly, this wasn't a studio anymore. It was something closer to a sanctuary. Backstage, no one dared speak above a whisper. The control room was still monitoring audio levels, but for the first time in recent memory, no one was worried about volume. They were watching not the cameras, not the clock, but the faces in the crowd. Something deeper than programming had taken hold. One of the associate producers turned to her supervisor. "Should we give Ellen a redirect? Maybe steer it back to something safe?" But the supervisor just shook his head slowly. Safe won't land anymore. Not after that. On stage, Ellen was beginning to feel that too. For years, she had thrived on energy, timing, and control. But now, none of her usual tools were working. Her note cards were tucked under her seat, forgotten. The lighting had shifted, but she hadn't noticed the change until the space itself felt altered, like they had all stepped out of a show and into something far more vulnerable. She took a breath, her voice softer now. "So, what do we do with all of this?" she asked. "With the silence, with the honesty, when we're used to laughter, and this doesn't feel like a talk show anymore?" Keanu looked at her, his hands folded in his lap. "You don't do anything," he said. "You let it be." He waited, then added, "Stillness isn't empty. It's full of things we've been too distracted to feel." A low murmur moved through the audience. Not a disruption, just the sound of people realizing they were no longer being entertained. They were being reached. A man in his 40s, sitting beside his teenage daughter, put his arm gently across her shoulders. She leaned in without a word. Near the back, an elderly woman clutched her purse close, tears welling in her eyes. She had planned to laugh today. Instead, she found herself thinking about someone she hadn't allowed herself to miss in years. Ellen looked out over the crowd. For once, they weren't performing either. No one was trying to be seen. No one was posing. It was a room full of people stripped of performance, just sitting with what was true. "It's strange," she said, almost to herself. "I've spent decades trying to fill every silence, and now I don't want this one to end." Keanu nodded gently. Maybe that's because it finally feels honest. He wasn't smug. He wasn't challenging her. He was simply stating what everyone could feel but hadn't known how to name. In the tech booth, a junior editor wiped at his eyes, trying not to be noticed. He'd never cried during a segment, not even the sad ones. But something about the way Keanu sat there, unshaken and present, cracked something open in him. A pause settled over the room once more. Not dare, not failure, but something sacred, something rarely captured on camera. In the booth, the director whispered into his headset, "Do not cue applause, let it breathe." No one argued. Even the network rep monitoring the segment, normally quick to flag anything unscripted, was silent. They were witnessing something they couldn't schedule, couldn't plan, and couldn't repeat. On stage, Ellen blinked slowly. She looked over at Keanu, then at the crowd. There was no laughter now, no distraction, just faces, open and bare. "I think I forgot what this felt like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Keanu asked gently. To just talk, to not need to win the room, to not be funny, to not be in control. Keanu's eyes softened, but he said nothing. Not yet. He was letting her arrive there on her own. Ellen folded her hands again and stared at her lap. "You know," she said, "I always thought stillness was something people feared, but maybe it's just something they forgot how to hold." Keanu nodded. "Because stillness asks us to feel, and feeling is messy. But it's also where healing begins." A hush swept over the audience like a wave. This wasn't about fame anymore. Not about Keanu's mystique or Ellen's brand. It was about what had cracked open inside every person watching. That quiet ache most had long learned to hide. Children. A young man near the front wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He hadn't meant to cry. He'd come because his mother dragged him along. But something in Keanu's stillness had made him remember his own. Moments when he sat in silence and hoped someone would notice. Ellen looked up again. Her tone shifted slightly. "You've lost a lot," she said, "more than most people ever know. And yet, you don't seem angry." Keanu sat with that for a moment, then replied, "Grief doesn't ask for anger. It asks for space." Another pause. Space to break and space to rebuild. The lights dimmed a little more, unplanned but fitting. The space felt smaller, softer, closer. Someone backstage began to cry. Quietly. Alone. Ellen leaned back again, arms crossed loosely now, no longer defensive. Just present. "You've changed the energy in this room," she said. "I didn't change it," Keanu answered. "I just stopped trying to control it." Ellen let out a quiet breath, her shoulders lowering for the first time since the interview began. She reached down and pulled out the final cue card. Then, after glancing at it for a second, she set it on the floor beside her. "I don't think I need these anymore," she said. Keanu smiled. "Only slightly. You never did." And in that moment, without music, without fanfare, without anyone being told to do so, the room collectively exhaled. It wasn't an ending. It was an arrival. And though no one knew what would happen next, no one was looking away. The room wasn't performing. The room had transformed. Ellen sat still for a beat too long, as if her body hadn't quite caught up with her thoughts. The air in the studio was still thick with the weight of the moment. Her usual instincts to pivot, to joke, to deflect, weren't reaching her. It felt like trying to swim in concrete. Then, with a shaky breath and a half laugh, she looked at Keanu and said, "Okay, now I have to ask, are you trying to be some kind of Hollywood Buddha?" The audience let out a light ripple of laughter, but it didn't travel far. It died halfway across the room. Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He simply responded with a softness that held no sarcasm. "No," he said. "I just stopped running from quiet." The way he said it wasn't self-righteous. It wasn't a punchline. It was a quiet statement of fact. And yet, somehow, it echoed louder than anything else that had been said. Ellen blinked and adjusted in her chair, her face searching for footing. Her smile didn't quite land the same way anymore. Her posture had loosened, and now, for the first time, so had her grip on the script she had built around herself. She tried again, this time leaning into what had once worked on every guest who veered too far from the show's rhythm. "But don't you think silence can be selfish?" There was something in her tone, not cruel, not mocking, but reaching. She was trying to get back to solid ground, to something that made sense in the world she was used to. Silence, in her framework, was emptiness, dangerous, a void that needed filling. Keanu didn't take offense. He didn't even look surprised. He looked at her with a kind of calm empathy, as though he understood that her question didn't come from arrogance. It came from fear. "Silence always risks misunderstanding," he said, "but so does every truth that matters." The moment stretched. Backstage, a junior producer stood frozen just outside the curtain, his headset slipping slightly as he turned to a nearby tech. "He's not flipping the room," he whispered. "He's freeing it." The tech didn't reply. He didn't need to. Ellen shifted again. Her eyes, once crisp with control, flickered now. Just enough for the cameras to catch the twitch at the corner. A hand that had been steady on her knee moved up to her necklace and began to fidget with the charm at the center. She was rattled. Not because she was being attacked, but because no one was playing the game. Keanu wasn't reacting. He wasn't sparring. He wasn't falling into any of the boxes she had spent years mastering. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do with the silence. Ellen's fingers curled slightly as she lowered her hand from her necklace. She glanced out at the audience, hoping for something, maybe a laugh, a warm expression, a cue that someone was still with her. But all she saw were faces waiting, eyes wide, brows relaxed, people simply listening. And then she did something unusual for a seasoned host. She stumbled. This isn't what I expected," she said, her voice thinner now. "People come here to talk, sure, but there's a rhythm. And today, it feels like I'm off beat." Keanu didn't try to rescue her. He let the pause linger. Then he said, "Maybe there's a deeper rhythm under the one we're used to." She exhaled, lips parting, eyes flicking to the crew just off stage. Her body language was fraying. Still composed but no longer polished, like someone whose stage lights had begun to dim from within. She reached for a joke again, her last instinctive defense. "Tell, what are you saying, that I've been running a drum line when I should have been sitting in a Zen garden?" A few audience members laughed softly, polite, sympathetic. But the laughter didn't grow. It wasn't oxygen. It was static. Keanu looked at her gently. Actually, most of us build noise to avoid the quiet, because in the quiet, we might hear something we're afraid of. That hit something inside her. She blinked quickly. Once, twice. "I used to fill every second of airtime," she admitted. "We were trained not to let anything go flat. Laughter every 20 seconds. Energy up, eyes bright, always ready with something clever." Keanu tilted his head slightly, listening without interruption. "And?" he asked. "And now," she said, swallowing, I don't know what to do without that." Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't bounce. It landed flat in her lap and stayed there. She wasn't hosting in that moment, she was unraveling. Carefully, slowly, like a seam she didn't realize had already started to tear. Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the real reason I came," he said. "Not to entertain, not to be interviewed, just to show what it looks like when someone doesn't fill the space with noise." Backstage, a lighting technician leaned forward and turned down the front row lights by instinct. The scene didn't need brightness anymore. It needed space. In the audience, a man leaned forward in his seat. He had been silent the entire show, hands in his lap, phone untouched. His mouth moved slightly as he whispered to himself, "This is real." On stage, Ellen looked back down at her lap. Her fingers were laced tightly now, knuckles pale. And then, for a second, her mask slipped entirely. She looked at Keanu and said, "You're not afraid of the quiet, are you?" He shook his head. "No," he said, "because it's where I finally learned who I was." Ellen stared at Keanu for a long moment. Her lips parted like she was about to respond, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched again, but this time it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like neither of them wanted to interrupt what had settled between them. The audience remained completely still. No rustling, no whispers. They weren't watching a segment anymore. They were witnessing something human, fragile and raw. "I think," Ellen finally said, her voice quieter now, "I've spent most of my life trying to outrun stillness. Like if I stopped moving, stopped smiling, something inside me might catch up." Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "And has it?" She nodded, just once. "Today it has." Behind the cameras, no one was giving direction anymore. The cue cards lay untouched. The applause light remained dark. And in the booth, the producers simply stared at the feed, unsure how to frame what was happening. Because it wasn't for framing. It wasn't for shaping. It was just for feeling. Ellen's fingers slowly relaxed in her lap. Her shoulders dropped. Her voice, so often sharp and perfectly pitched, cracked just slightly. "I built a world where I always had the last word," she said, "where every sentence ended with a laugh or a clever line, because if people were laughing, they couldn't look too closely. They couldn't see what I didn't want them to see." Keanu sat with that, quietly. "You ever feel like that?" she asked. "Like, if you let someone see too much of you, they'll disappear?" Keanu took a breath, then nodded. "All the time," he said. "But the right ones don't disappear. They just sit with you, even in the dark." A tear slipped from Ellen's left eye. She didn't wipe it away, not right away. She looked at him and said, "You make it sound so easy." He shook his head. "It's not, but it's worth it." For the first time in the entire segment, Ellen didn't try to pivot. She didn't try to control the narrative or chase a closing line. She just let the silence sit. A young woman in the third row pulled her hoodie tight around her shoulders, her eyes wet. A man near the back sat forward, elbows on knees, hands folded as if in prayer. Backstage, a junior writer turned to her colleague and whispered, "This is the best show we've ever done." "No," the other replied. "It's not a show anymore." Ellen looked back at Keanu. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" she asked. "To before it all got loud?" Keanu thought for a moment. "No," he said. "But I do wish we knew then what we're starting to remember now." "What's that?" she asked. "That we don't have to be loud to be heard. We don't have to shine to matter." She nodded slowly, tears brimming again. "And we don't have to smile to be loved." Keanu smiled just once, soft and real. "No," he said, "we just have to show up." Ellen shifted again in her chair, visibly trying to regain footing. The honesty between them had reached a depth she hadn't anticipated. For a moment, she had allowed herself to fall into it. But instinct, the old muscle memory of years performing for millions, made her reach for control again. She picked up a fresh card from the stack under her seat. One she hadn't planned to use, but now felt like her only way forward. "You know," she said, straightening her posture, "some people say what you do is just a different kind of performance. The whole humble, quiet, wounded mystic thing." The crowd tensed. A few people blinked hard, unsure if they'd misheard. Ellen had dropped her softness and gone back to the edge, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because part of her was afraid that if she didn't reassert control, she'd fall apart on live television. Keanu looked at her. Not offended, not angry. Just all. "I've heard that," he said. "And?" she pressed. He sat back slightly. His voice stayed low, steady, unshaken. "I'd trade every bit of fame I've ever had for one more hour with the people I lost." The audience went completely still. There was no need to explain who he meant. They all knew. His daughter, his partner, his best friends. The grief woven quietly into every movie, every interview, every step through an airport. It wasn't myth. It was memory. A woman in the audience covered her mouth with both hands, trying not to cry. A man reached across the aisle to hold his wife's hand. Keanu continued, the words coming slow, each one deliberate. "This industry gives you applause, it gives you attention, but that's not the same as love." He glanced down for a moment, his hands gently folded in his lap. Love isn't loud, it's not broadcast, it's not waiting for the next headline. It's sitting next to someone who's hurting and not trying to fix it, just being there, just staying. The audience held its breath. Even the sound techs backstage forgot to breathe for a few seconds. Ellen, for once, had no response ready. Keanu lifted his eyes again, and the weight in them was unmistakable. "After my daughter died," he said, "I walked through a hotel lobby, and no one knew. Reporters were asking about my next film, cameras were flashing, people wanted smiles. But inside, I was gone." He took another breath. "I remember thinking, if I screamed in the middle of the crowd, would anyone even hear me?" No one moved. No one coughed. The audience wasn't just watching now, they were inside it. Inside that grief, that moment. And Ellen, she was too. Ellen sat frozen in her seat. The usual flicker behind her eyes, calculation, rhythm, control, had vanished. What Keanu had just shared didn't feel like part of a segment. It wasn't a confession timed to land at minute 20 for emotional punch. It was real, unguarded, and impossibly raw. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," Keanu replied. "Most people don't. That's not their fault. That's just the nature of noise." She slowly reached for her water glass, then set it back down without taking a sip. He looked at her again, softer this time. "I'm not performing humility, Ellen. I'm surviving grief." That sentence broke something wide open in the room. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift. As if every person in that audience, every staffer behind the curtain, suddenly realized they weren't watching someone strong in spite of loss. They were watching someone strong because of it. Backstage, one of the segment producers wiped at her eyes and turned away from the monitor. She'd worked hundreds of episodes. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt something like this. Ellen's voice came back, quieter now. How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything feels broken?" Keanu leaned forward slightly. "By not pretending I'm not broken." He paused. "And by remembering that broken isn't the same as worthless." A soft murmur traveled through the crowd, like wind through leaves, not disruptive, but collective. Ellen swallowed hard. "I've made jokes about grief before. I've turned pain into punchlines. It was how I survived things I didn't know how to say." Keanu nodded. "I understand. Sometimes we laugh because we're too scared to cry, but there comes a moment when the laughter fades and the silence stays. That's when we decide who we really are." The audience sat with that. No movement, no shifting, only eyes and breath. Keanu continued, "I remember the funeral. I remember the silence afterward. And I remember being asked how I kept going, and I said something simple, but I meant it. He looked up. You keep going by not letting pain be the last word. The crew in the booth was silent. No one reached for the commercial cue. No one was even watching the clock anymore. Ellen's shoulders had slumped slightly, but not in defeat, in honesty, in exhaustion, like someone who had carried a performance for far too long and was finally setting it down. I've chased applause my whole life, she admitted. Maybe because I thought it would drown out the things I didn't want to face. Keanu said nothing. He just waited. That silence, the one she had feared for so long, was no longer her enemy. It was becoming her refuge. Ellen leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, fingers laced together as if trying to hold something inside from spilling out. Her voice, when it came again, was almost inaudible. I used to think attention was the same as being loved. Keanu nodded slowly. It's not. I know that now, she said, but I didn't for a long time. There was no judgment in Keanu's eyes, only understanding. You're not the only one, he said. This business teaches us to confuse the two. It teaches us that if they're watching, they care. But sometimes they're just watching because they've forgotten how to feel. He paused, then added gently, and sometimes, so have we. A tear slipped down Ellen's cheek again. This time she didn't wipe it away. She didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She just let it fall. I'm tired, she admitted, of trying to prove something, of needing to be interesting enough to be seen. You already are, Keanu said. We all are. Even when we're quiet, even when we're grieving, even when we don't know what to say. The audience sat motionless, not because they were afraid to move, but because they finally understood the weight of what was happening. A woman on a stage who had spent her entire life filling rooms with sound was being told, by someone who had lost everything, that she didn't need to fill anything to be worthy. I wish someone had told me that earlier, Ellen whispered. Keanu didn't say anything, because sometimes the answer is in the listening. After a long pause, he finally added, I've had more conversations in silence than I ever had in interviews. He looked out at the crowd. I've sat next to strangers in hospital waiting rooms, on trains, in empty church pews, and not said a word. And in those moments, I felt more seen than in 1,000 premieres. A woman in the second row nodded, eyes glassy. A man further back removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. And Ellen once again looked at her hands. Densely gave you attention, she repeated, echoing his earlier words. Not love. Keanu nodded. I'd trade all of it, every award, every role, every headline, for one more hour with my daughter. The room exhaled. No gasp, no sound, just a wave of collective heartbreak and recognition. Ellen's voice cracked as she said, and yet, you still sit here, still share, still offer yourself. Because I don't want silence to be something people fear anymore, he said. I want them to see it can be a home. The audience didn't applaud. They couldn't. They were sitting with too much. And that was exactly the point. Ellen's fingers hovered above the last cue card in her lap. The edges of it were crisp. A fresh card brought out minutes earlier by her assistant. She hadn't looked at it until now. The segment was already so far from what it was supposed to be, she didn't know what she was reaching for. Control, clarity, or just something that felt familiar. But when her eyes finally dropped to the words printed across the top in bold marker, something in her stilled. Ask about Father's death. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even phrased softly. Just an instruction. A card prepared earlier that morning, part of a carefully mapped arc. One of the producers had mentioned it in passing backstage. It'll make him human. Let the audience connect. Now, holding it in her hand, Ellen felt something else. Shame. Her fingers pressed against the card, her jaw clenched. Then, without a word, she folded it once, then again, and slid it beneath her chair. She didn't look at Keanu when she did it. but he felt it. He didn't move. Garrett didn't lean in, didn't ask. But something in him registered the shift. And then he turned, not to Ellen, but to the audience. He looked out at the crowd, at every face watching him, and then said something so quietly that it required everyone to lean in just to hear it. "You don't have to perform your worth." He let that breathe, then continued, "You don't need applause to be real." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, the kind of silence that wraps around a room when something is said that everyone has needed to hear but didn't know how to ask for. "You don't have to hustle to be enough," he said. "You don't have to smile when you're breaking. You don't have to say the right thing when you don't know what you feel." Ellen slowly looked up, watching him. Her hands were now empty, resting in her lap, her shoulders slack. There was no segment anymore, no set rhythm. Just him, speaking not as a guest, but as someone offering permission. "And you don't have to wait for someone to call you worthy," he said. "You already are." A woman near the front row began to cry again, not gently this time, but fully. She didn't wipe her tears. She just let them fall. A teenage boy stood, slowly, as if his body moved before his brain could catch up. His hands trembled slightly. He wasn't reacting to drama. He was reacting to truth. And then, one by one, others began to rise. Not as a wave, not as a cue, but as something deeper. A collective exhale turned physical. People standing, not to honor a celebrity, but because something inside them had been named. Seen. Freed. Keanu remained seated, his hands resting quietly on his lap. His gaze soft, steady, as if this moment wasn't a surprise, but something he had hoped for all along. Ellen looked out at the audience, then back at Keanu. She didn't speak. There was nothing to add, no clever transition or line to reclaim the moment. It didn't belong to her anymore. It didn't belong to the show. It belonged to the people now standing on their feet, some with tears, some with their hands clasped tightly, all of them united in something unspoken. Backstage, the assistant director spoke softly into the headset. "They're standing, all of them." The producer on the other end whispered, "Is that in response to the line?" "No," the director answered. "It's in response to the truth." On stage, Keanu lowered his head slightly, acknowledging them, not as fans, not as an audience, but as people. People who had forgotten they were allowed to stop performing, too. "I don't know why we started believing we had to earn love," he said quietly. "Why we started treating approval like oxygen." He looked across the sea of faces. Some people were holding each other. Some were alone, arms wrapped around themselves like shields. But none of them looked away. "We don't need to be interesting to be seen," Keanu said. "We don't need to be successful to be enough." He shifted slightly in his seat, never breaking eye contact with the room. "We're allowed to be soft," he added, "even when the world rewards us for being sharp." A murmur passed through the crowd again, this time not of confusion, but of release, like something buried deep inside them had been given permission to surface. Ellen watched him, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't Ellen the host. She wasn't the brand or the voice or the rhythm behind the camera. She was just a woman in a chair, watching someone speak the words she didn't know she needed. The card with the question about Keanu's father still sat beneath her chair, folded and untouched. She glanced at it once, then looked away. She knew it could have made for a powerful moment on screen, an emotional dig, a vulnerable tear, but now it felt small, artificial, a question meant for a version of Keanu that no longer existed in this room, if it ever had. He looked over at her now, not with judgment, not with expectation, just presence. And it was that presence that brought something inside her to the surface. "I almost asked you about your father," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Keanu didn't react. She continued, "It was on the card." the next step in the arc. I was supposed to bring it up and let the audience see you. Break. He was still watching her, still silent. But I couldn't, she said. Not because I was afraid of upsetting you, but because I realized how many times I've done that to people. Pushed them past their breaking point for a better segment. He didn't speak, just nodded once, slowly. And then she said something she hadn't planned. I think I've been performing being real for so long, I forgot what it felt like to actually be it. The room stayed standing. No one sat back down. Because no one wanted to. They were no longer waiting for the next moment. They were inside it. Backstage, the studio was silent. The kind of silence that felt alive. No one moved to break it. The lighting crew remained at their posts, headphones still on but not speaking. A makeup artist stood frozen near the hallway, brush in hand, no longer concerned about touch-ups or appearance. Coffee cups sat untouched on the catering table. No one checked their phones. No one refreshed scripts. No one asked, "What's next?" The air was filled with something none of them could quite name. Not tension, not awe, just stillness. And a kind of quiet reverence. It didn't feel like a show had just ended. It felt like something else had begun. The executive producer, usually the first to charge in with notes or next steps, stood motionless by the monitor, arms crossed tightly, breathing slow. Her lips trembled slightly, but she said nothing. She only watched the playback, which someone had instinctively looped without being told. In the hallway outside the green room, a young intern sat against the wall, knees pulled to their chest. They weren't crying, but their eyes were red, and they kept whispering the same thing to themselves over and over. I didn't know words could feel like that. That night, the network did something unprecedented. They aired the interview uncut. No edits, no breaks, no commercial interruption. The broadcast opened with a disclaimer. Tonight's interview will run in full, uninterrupted. We believe it speaks for itself. And it did. Across homes, airports, hospital rooms, apartments, college dorms, and quiet bedrooms, people watched and felt. The first wave of comments came in within minutes. Made me cry, and I don't even know why. This wasn't a talk show. This was church. I watched it twice, then I called my mom. On a commuter train in Chicago, a nurse on the night shift watched the segment on her phone during a 5-minute break. She hadn't meant to cry. She hadn't even meant to watch the whole thing. But somewhere around minute 12, when Keanu said, "You don't have to perform your worth," she paused the video and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding all year. She watched the rest with her palm pressed to her chest, as if trying to hold something in place. At a small apartment in Seoul, a teenage girl sat at her vanity, phone resting in her lap, video playing. Her face was perfectly made up, filters on, angles checked. But when she heard Keanu say, "We don't need to be interesting to be seen," she reached up, wiped her face clean, and turned off every setting that had been designed to make her appear more than she was. In a darkened room in Sao Paulo, a man in his 60s sat watching the interview with headphones on. His daughter had sent him the link, said it might help him sleep. He didn't expect anything. But as Keanu spoke about grief and the silence that follows loss, the man whispered, barely audible, "This is me." Then he opened his phone and typed a message he hadn't written in 10 years. "Hi, son. Are you still out there?" In a college dorm in Nebraska, 3 roommates watched in silence, surrounded by open laptops and half-finished assignments. One of them, Lena, had always been the funny one, the one who made self-deprecating jokes about everything, especially when things hurt. But when Keanu said, "Sometimes we laugh because we're too scared to cry," she turned her head away and muttered, "That's me," like it was a confession. One of the others reached out and put a hand on her back. No one said anything. No one had to. They just let her sit in the truth for a while, knowing now it was safe to do so. In a studio apartment in London, A man stood in front of his mirror after the show, suit still on from work. He'd spent years building his image. Sharp suits, clever lines, cold charm. But something Keanu said had gotten under the fabric. He slipped off the blazer, loosened the tie, and whispered, "I don't want to be admired anymore. I want to be known." He opened his closet and saw for the first time how much armor he'd collected. In a rural town in Idaho, a mother watched with her daughter curled up beside her. When Keanu spoke about trading all the fame in the world for just one more hour with the people he'd lost, the mother clutched her daughter a little tighter. She had lost her own sister 2 years ago and had never known how to talk about it. But that night, after the show, she said her sister's name aloud for the first time since the funeral. Her daughter asked questions, and she answered them, gently, honestly, without fear. And in a small apartment in Queens, a 17-year-old boy who had spent most of his teenage years trying not to feel too much or show too much sat watching the segment on his cracked phone screen. He was supposed to be studying. He didn't know why he clicked on the video, but when it ended, he stared at the black screen and whispered, "I didn't know it was okay to hurt." Then he opened a notebook and started to write. Not for an assignment, not for school, just to remember how he felt. The ripple traveled further than the network ever expected. It crossed languages, continents, algorithms, and assumptions. It made its way into waiting rooms and laundromats, into the back of Ubers and the glow of midnight kitchens. And in those quiet places, people stopped scrolling, stopped performing. Just for a few minutes, they put down the armor, let their breathing slow, and remembered that they were still here. Not because they were perfect, not because they were strong, but because something inside them had been waiting, aching for someone to say, "You're already enough." And Keanu had said it, not as a celebrity, not as a performer, but as a man who had once lost everything and who had found peace in telling the world, "You don't have to earn love, you just have to stop hiding from it." The noise of the world faltered, and for a night, people listened. Ellen sat alone in her dressing room, long after the crew had left and the lights had been dimmed. The room looked smaller now, quieter. The mirrors no longer reflected a stage persona. They reflected a woman trying to remember who she used to be before all the noise. In her lap rested a leather-bound notebook, the edges worn, the pages yellowing. She hadn't touched it in years. It had been shoved to the back of a drawer beneath scripts, cue cards, and branded merchandise. She found it that morning without even meaning to, while searching for a pen. Inside were notes scribbled decades ago, before the fame, before the cameras, before she was Ellen. The first page was dated in the top corner, just a small sentence written in blue ink. "I just want to make people feel better." She stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't profound, it wasn't polished, but it was real, raw. A sentence born from hunger, not for attention, but for connection. A hunger she barely recognized anymore. She flipped through the pages, jokes half-written, ideas for sketches, names of friends she no longer talked to, little mantras like, "Don't forget to listen," or "Let it be awkward. It means it's real." And then one, circled in red pen, "Stop performing when you're in pain." Her throat tightened. No one had ever canceled her for that. But maybe she had canceled herself. Not with one big moment, but with 1,000 small ones. Moments when she chose the easy laugh instead of the uncomfortable truth. Moments when she felt the sting of shame and buried it in sarcasm. Moments when someone cried in front of her and she changed the subject. She wasn't proud of those choices, but for the first time, she let herself see them. "I've been performing too long," she whispered to the quiet room. There was no audience to react, no one to applaud the revelation, and that was the point. Down the hallway, her team had gathered in the break area. They were silent too, but not tense, not afraid, just respectful. No one rushed to debrief, No one bombarded her with feedback or ratings or tweets. They understood something sacred had happened, and sacred things need stillness afterward. A producer who had worked with Ellen for 12 years leaned against the wall, sipping tea slowly. She glanced toward the hallway, toward Ellen's dressing room, and said softly, "She's not broken. She's unfolding." Inside the room, Ellen picked up her phone. She opened a message window to Keanu, then stared at the blinking cursor. She started typing, "Thank you for your honesty. I've been afraid of mine." Delete. New line. "It reminded me of who I was before I learned to fake it." Delete. She tried again. "I'm sorry." She paused. Let it sit. Then deleted that too. She didn't hit send, not because she didn't mean it, but because she realized something more important. She wasn't ready to perform honesty either. She wanted to live it, and that would take time. Ellen placed the phone face down beside her and leaned back in the chair. The silence felt different now, not lonely, but earned. It was the kind of silence that used to scare her, that used to feel like failure. Now it felt like a beginning. She looked at her reflection again. Her makeup had faded. The edges of her eyes were softer. For the first time in years, she didn't see a brand. She saw a woman who had been brave enough to stop pretending, even just for a moment. She pulled her knees up into the chair and held the notebook close. One page caught her attention, folded at the corner. She unfolded it and read the scrawl she'd written after her first small stand-up gig in a half-empty bar. "Be real, even if it's weird, especially if it's weird. That's how they'll find you." She smiled at that. It was so simple, so unfiltered. That version of her had wanted connection more than approval. Somewhere along the way, the wiring got crossed. But tonight, something in that wiring had reset, and Keanu hadn't said anything new. He hadn't shouted or demanded attention. He hadn't needed a comeback or a clever twist. He had just stayed still, and by doing so, held up a mirror not just to her, but to everyone watching. Ellen thought about all the years she'd chased laughter like currency, about the time she gave a guest a compliment she didn't mean just to ease the tension, about the time she dodged a coworker's pain by handing them a punchline, about how performance had become protection. She wasn't going to undo it all overnight, but she could start by not repeating it. She glanced at the message to Keanu again, now minimized on her phone. She didn't feel the urge to send it. Not yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what mattered more was what she did next, how she spoke to her team, how she showed up tomorrow, how she let stillness speak without interrupting it. The apology could wait. The transformation had already begun. Outside, the hallway remained dim and quiet. A few staff members had left handwritten notes on her door. Not critiques, not agendas, just short lines. That was brave. The thank you? "I remembered something about myself tonight. I'm not sure what yet, but thank you." Ellen ran her fingers over one of the notes and pressed it to her chest. She didn't need a press release. She didn't need an Instagram statement. She just needed time to rebuild, not her image, but her relationship to truth. She stood, finally, and turned off the mirror lights herself. The glow faded slowly, leaving only the soft light from the hallway as she stepped into it. She didn't speak. She didn't smile for anyone's benefit. But as she walked past her team, they looked up, not to watch her, but to walk with her. They didn't need her to lead the way tonight. They just needed her to be real. And for the first time in a long time, Ellen was willing to try. It was a short clip, grainy, filmed through the small window of a hospice room. There were no filters, no lighting adjustments, no captions. Just a man sitting in a chair beside a hospital bed, reading softly from a worn paperback book. The man was Keanu Reeves, and the patient was a retired train conductor named Walter Raines, 84 years old with no living family. The clip was posted late at night by a nurse named Lila Torres. She didn't tag anyone, she didn't add music, she didn't even mention who the man in the chair was, not at first. Her caption was just a few words. "I've never seen someone sit that still, that long, for someone no one remembered." By morning, the clip had been seen by over 1 million people, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. Walter had been at the facility for 3 months. No visitors, no calls, no flowers. He had spent most of his days staring out the window at the tracks beyond the trees, barely speaking. The staff did what they could, but it was hard to reach someone who had already gone so far inside. Then one day, Keanu showed up. He didn't arrive with a camera crew. He didn't post about it on social media. He didn't alert the press. He just came through the front door, holding a book of poetry and a single paper bag from a small bakery nearby. "I heard you used to drive trains," he said softly to Walter. "My dad did too. I thought maybe we could sit a while." Walter didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. So Keanu pulled the chair closer and read. He read for nearly 2 hours, never checking his phone, never shifting in his seat. When Walter dozed off, Keanu stayed. When he stirred, Keanu offered him a sip of water and kept reading. It wasn't a performance. It was presence. Lila had passed by the room 3 times before she dared to peek in through the window and record a few seconds. She hadn't planned to share it, but something about the way Keanu sat, so quietly, without need for credit, stirred something in her. A reminder she later wrote that kindness isn't something you plan, it's something you practice. In the clip, Keanu's voice is barely audible. "And maybe the moon will remember your name," he reads. Walter's hand twitches, and for a brief moment, the stillness becomes everything. When the clip went viral, people scrambled to confirm its authenticity. It didn't take long. Staff confirmed. A bakery clerk remembered Keanu's quiet visit. An old logbook showed he had been there before, twice in fact. No press, no notice, just him showing up. Someone found Walter's old conductor badge. They posted a photo. A stranger paid for flowers to be delivered to the hospice the next morning. Walter passed away 3 days later. But for those last days, he wasn't alone, and the world knew it. After the clip made its rounds, people didn't just share it, they sat with it. Unlike most viral videos, there was no punchline, no twist, no call to action, just a man, a book, and another man whose life was quietly honored. Leela, the nurse who posted it, received thousands of messages. Some were from people thanking her for reminding the world that tenderness still existed. Others were from those who had worked in palliative care and felt seen for the first time. But one message stood out among the rest. It was from Walter's old colleague Leon, now 91, who hadn't seen Walter in over 30 years. He wrote, "I thought he was already gone. Thank you for letting me know. He left with someone by his side. That matters." It mattered more than views, more than fame. Because when someone like Keanu sits still in a room that no one else notices, it tells the world something important. No one is too small to be remembered. The clip made its way to forums where people rarely spoke of feelings. Finance threads, coding groups, even war veterans pages. And yet, everywhere it appeared, the comments sections changed. "I visited my grandfather's grave for the first time in 12 years. I read to my mom today. She didn't respond, but I stayed. I don't know why this broke me, but it did." The impact wasn't loud. It didn't come with awards or headlines, but it had a weight, a kind of slow, invisible healing. That week, hospice volunteer applications across the country rose by 18%. A poetry bookstore in Oregon sold out of the same collection Keanu had read from. One hospital began a quiet room project, where volunteers could come and sit with patients who had no one left to visit. And through it all, Keanu said nothing. He gave no interview. He issued no statement. He simply continued showing up, unseen, uninvited, but deeply needed. Back at the hospice, Lila found herself rethinking her job. For years, she had rushed through her rounds, overwhelmed and undersupported. But after that day, she slowed down. She asked questions she had been afraid to ask before. What did you love most? Do you want music today? Would you like me to stay a little longer? She began writing down the names and stories of her patients, creating a kind of quiet legacy for each of them. Not because it would be read, but because it meant they had lived, and someone had witnessed it. The clip became more than a video. It became a mirror, and in that mirror, people saw something they didn't expect. That stillness in a noisy world can be the loudest form of love. For Keanu, it wasn't a role, it wasn't even a message, it was just a choice. To be there, to listen, to remember someone the world had forgotten. And in doing so, he reminded millions that the quietest moments can hold the deepest meaning. It didn't happen all at once. There was no headline, no viral hashtag, no industry announcement, but something began to shift, not just online, not just in studios, but in people. In the weeks after the interview with Keanu aired, talk shows across the country started to feel different. It began with subtle pauses. Hosts who normally filled every second with noise and laughter let a question hang in the air a little longer. They looked guests in the eyes instead of checking cue cards. They stopped cutting off emotional answers for the sake of a punchline. A popular late-night host who had built a brand on fast wit and sharp sarcasm opened his monologue with a confession. "I used to think silence was dead air," he said. "Now I think maybe it's where the truth hides." The audience clapped slowly, not out of habit but understanding. Another daytime host, famous for flashy giveaways and high-energy games, closed one episode with a different tone. She sat in a chair across from an aging schoolteacher who had never gone viral, never held a mic, and never asked to be seen. For 12 minutes, they talked about how it felt to be forgotten after retirement. There were no jokes, no prizes, no background music. His presence. After the segment aired, letters poured in, not emails, actual letters. "Thank you for reminding me that people like her still exist. She taught me 35 years ago. I'd forgotten her face, but not her voice. Please keep doing more like this." It wasn't ratings-driven. It wasn't PR. It was something older, something real. The public had seen something in Keanu's stillness, something that lingered long after the cameras shut off. For once, the audience wasn't asking for more. They were asking for less. Less performance, less polish, less distance between the person and the persona. Even guests felt it. One young actor, known for his high-energy interviews, appeared on a major morning show and sat differently. When the host asked usual round of rapid-fire questions, he paused and said, "Can we talk slower today? I'm kind of tired of being funny." And instead of laughing, the audience nodded. They understood. Behind the scenes, producers met quietly in rooms filled with whiteboards and notes. There was no crisis, no controversy, just a question hanging in the air. What are we actually making? One showrunner leaned back in his chair and murmured, "Whatever he did, it worked." Not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. They didn't even have to say his name anymore. Everyone in the room knew who he was. Keanu had become something more than a celebrity. He had become a reference point, a standard. Not for perfection, not for sainthood, but for presence. For the idea that maybe, just maybe, being human was enough. And still, through it all, Keanu said nothing online. No statement, no tweet, no endorsement. He didn't capitalize on the moment. He didn't try to brand it. He just kept showing up. Sometimes at a children's hospital, sometimes at a library, sometimes just on a sidewalk, listening to someone who needed to be heard. No cameras followed, no headlines chased him, but stories emerged anyway, from people, not press. A barista in Chicago shared a story on a quiet blog that barely got 20 likes. She wrote about how Keanu came in during a snowstorm, ordered chamomile tea, and stayed seated at the far corner of the cafe for nearly 3 hours. He didn't ask for Wi-Fi. He didn't look at his phone. He watched the snow and helped her close when a regular didn't show up for the late shift. He took out the trash, he mopped the floors, he thanked her twice. She ended the post with, "He left behind a napkin with a quote, 'I'll never forget. The way you do the small things is the way you do everything.'" Another post came from a high school custodian in Kansas. He described finding Keanu sitting alone on the bleachers after a charity event. No one else had noticed he stayed behind. The custodian thought maybe he was waiting for a ride, but when he approached, Keanu simply said, "Just needed a little more quiet before stepping back into the world." These weren't performances, they weren't photo ops, they were choices. And people noticed. A fashion blogger paused her usual haul videos to reflect on the hospice clip. "He made me question why I only feel seen when I'm styled," she said. "I want to know who I am when I'm not trying." A famous podcaster known for edgy commentary took a week off. When she returned, she opened with a raw admission. "I don't know how to be still. I don't know how to be kind without needing credit, but I want to learn." And across platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, there was a quiet current of change. The content didn't become boring, it became braver. People started showing up without filters. Artists painted grief. Dancers filmed themselves failing before perfecting a routine. Musicians shared the first messy takes, not just the polished performances. Storytellers stopped chasing likes and started chasing honesty. It wasn't a revolution in the traditional sense. No marches, no slogans, no brands. Just a return to meaning, to the kind of connection that doesn't require a camera to be real. And still, Keanu said nothing. He didn't acknowledge the shift he helped inspire. He didn't correct those who got it wrong. He didn't bask in being right. He simply kept doing what he'd always done. He showed up. He sat still. He listened. And the world, without even realizing it, began to do the same. In one of the most shared quotes from the original interview, Keanu had said, "You don't need applause to be real." Now that line appeared everywhere, on posters in schools, on mirrors in nursing homes, inside letters sent from parents to children who had drifted away. But the quote wasn't what people clung to. It was the silence that followed it. That rare kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled because it already means something. And in that silence, something had shifted. The industry didn't fall apart. It softened. The audience didn't. They leaned in. And the world, louder than ever before, found one man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. It started with an empty stage. No monologue, no music, no spotlight chasing a performer. Just Ellen, seated in a simple armchair, holding a folded piece of paper. She looked different. Not younger, not older, just stripped of something, as if a costume had been quietly set down after years of wear. "This," she began, "isn't the show you're used to, and honestly, I hope it never is again." There was no applause sign. The studio audience sat quietly, unsure whether to clap, speak, or simply listen. Ellen unfolded the paper in her hands. She explained that she had launched a new segment, one she didn't plan to name at first, but someone had sent her a letter, and the phrase "inside," it wouldn't leave her mind. It said, "Some of us are the quiet ones. Doesn't mean we don't have something to say." So she called it Letters from the Quiet Ones. Each week, someone would come, not for performance, but presence. They would read a letter they'd never shared before, not to entertain, but to release something that had been held in for far too long. The first guest was a middle-aged man named Carl. He was a bus mechanic from Minnesota. No acting background, no social media following, just a man who had written a letter to the father who left when he was 7. Carl's voice trembled. "Dear Dad," he read, "I used to think I hated you, but really, I hated how much I missed you." He paused, eyes wet. "I became a mechanic because I remembered how you always loved engines. I guess I thought if I could fix things, maybe one day, I'd know how to fix myself too." The audience didn't move. No clapping, no laughter, just breathing. Ellen sat beside him, not as a host, but as a witness. When he finished, she didn't launch into a closing segment. She didn't pivot to comedy. She simply thanked him and placed a hand on his shoulder. That episode didn't trend. It didn't generate memes. It didn't go viral. But it didn't need to. Because something deeper happened. People wrote in. Thousands of letters, emails, handwritten notes. Many started with, "I thought I'd forgotten this," or "I haven't told anyone, but..." A woman named Shay wrote from prison, thanking the show for reminding her she was still more than her worst day. A teenager in Iowa sent in a drawing of his grandfather with a note that read, "He died before I could say thank you, but now I will," out loud. The next episode featured a letter from a hospice nurse to a patient who had passed before she could say goodbye. "I didn't know how to tell you that you changed me," she read, "but I know now, and that matters." It was quiet, gentle, unassuming, but people leaned in. And Ellen changed too. She no longer entered the stage to music. She didn't dance. She didn't joke for the sake of filling space. Instead, she listened. Sometimes with tears in her eyes, sometimes with no words at all. She wore simpler clothes, stopped wearing makeup on certain episodes, even began asking her team to stop editing out the silences. Because, as she told them, that's where the truth lives now. The network had doubts at first. Producers questioned the ratings, advertisers hesitated. But Ellen didn't budge. She told them, if we lose money telling the truth, maybe we've been rich for the wrong reasons. In time, the tide turned. Sponsors began supporting the segment not because it generated buzz, but because it inspired letters. Physical, handwritten letters from viewers, something they hadn't seen in years. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. And that was rarer than ever. Ellen began receiving notes from past guests who said the experience changed them. One wrote, "After I read my letter, my daughter hugged me for the first time in 6 years." Another said, "I stopped trying to go viral. I started trying to be real." The show's impact wasn't explosive. It was slow, like soil-absorbing rain after a long drought, gentle, but lasting. A former critic who once mocked Ellen's old style posted an unexpected review. "I used to think authenticity couldn't survive on a stage. I was wrong." Behind the scenes, the atmosphere had changed too. Writers no longer pitched punchlines. They pitched stories. Small, human, true. The lighting crew dimmed things more intentionally now. The cameras didn't zoom for drama. They lingered, allowing emotion to breathe. And perhaps the biggest shift of all came not from the studio, but from the audience. A teenager from Atlanta sent in a message that Ellen read aloud during an episode. "You used to feel untouchable. Now you feel like one of us." Ellen paused after reading it. Her eyes watered, but she didn't wipe them away. She just nodded. "Maybe that's the point," she said softly. "Maybe we're all trying to come home to ourselves." In another episode, a mother shared a letter to the child she lost in a miscarriage years ago. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "I never got to hold you, but you've held me every day since." No one in the room moved. Not a sound, not a cough. And when she finished, Ellen didn't speak right away. She simply placed a candle on the table in front of them. No explanation needed. That moment became the quiet symbol of the show. Not a logo, not a catchphrase, just a candle lit in stillness, in memory, in meaning. Over time, Ellen's name changed meaning for viewers. No longer just synonymous with fame or comedy, it became something else, something closer to courage, to redemption, to grace under reconstruction. People didn't tune in to be entertained anymore. They tuned in to feel less alone. And though the show never topped the charts again, it didn't have to. It reached deeper places. The kind of places where applause doesn't echo, but healing does. Ellen's team began keeping a wall of letters in their office, not framed, just pinned up. Paper after paper, messy handwriting, smudged ink, sometimes tear-stained. Each one a quiet testimony that the world still hungers for something real. And Ellen, once the queen of spectacle, now found peace in that simplicity. She still hadn't sent the message she wrote to Keanu. Not because she was afraid, but because something told her. He already knew. The morning was quiet, not staged, not scheduled, just real. Keanu Reeves stood barefoot in the grass behind his home, watering a small bed of lavender and chamomile. The hose moved slowly in his hand, water arcing gently over green leaves that shimmered under the California sun. He didn't have earbuds in, no assistant nearby, no cameras lurking behind the fence, just bird song and the smell of earth after early dew. The yard wasn't manicured like a celebrity estate. There were weeds near the back fence and a section of stones that led nowhere. But that was the point. Keanu didn't need perfection. He needed peace. Jake, his longtime friend and occasional assistant, stepped through the back door holding a small envelope. He hesitated at first. Keanu looked over his shoulder and smiled gently, gesturing him closer. Jake walked up, handed him the letter. "This one's heavier than most." Keanu nodded. He never opened these letters in a hurry. He turned off the hose, letting it fall quietly in the grass. He wiped his hands on the side of his pants and sat cross-legged near the edge of the garden, motioning for Jake to sit too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Keanu opened the envelope. The handwriting was soft, rounded. You could tell the person who wrote it paused often. It began simply, "Dear Mr. Reeves, my name is Sarah. I lost my son 2 months ago. His name was Eli. He was 17. Keanu's hand held the paper still, his eyes scanned slowly. He left a note before he went. It wasn't long, but the last line read, "Tell Keanu thanks for showing me I didn't have to pretend to be okay." Keanu closed his eyes briefly. I don't know how he found your interviews or why they mattered to him so much, but I want you to know that you were the one voice he trusted, the one he said didn't need fixing, the one who made stillness feel safe. Thank you for that gift. I wish it had been enough to keep him here, but maybe it was enough to make him feel loved for a while. Keanu let out a slow breath. Jake looked at him, eyes wet. "You okay?" Keanu nodded once. "Yeah." He stood up and walked toward the small wooden box tucked beneath a maple tree at the edge of the garden. It wasn't fancy, just a carved chest with a broken hinge, aged by weather and time. Inside were hundreds of folded letters, some typed, some handwritten, some on torn notebook paper, some on scented stationery. He added Sarah's letter to the top of the pile, placing a small polished stone over it to keep it from flying away. Then he sat beside the box and looked out at the sky. Jake joined him, quiet. After a long pause, Keanu whispered, "They don't write to me." "Not really." Jake glanced at him, and he write to the part of themselves they thought no one else could see. Another pause, and now they're starting to see it. Jake leaned back against the tree, his arms resting loosely across his knees. "You ever ride back?" he asked quietly. Keanu shook his head. "Not directly." Jake tilted his head. "Why not? I mean, you could." Keanu looked out over the yard, watching as a butterfly hovered briefly over the lavender before floating away. "Because the reply they need isn't a letter," he said softly. "It's someone staying quiet long enough to feel what they said. Most people never get that." Jake let the words settle. The wind moved gently through the branches, and for a moment, time felt slower, realer. Keanu reached beside him and opened a small notebook tucked between the stones. He had been keeping it for years. Not a journal, not quite. Just moments, phrases, things people had said to him that he couldn't forget. He turned a few pages and wrote, "It told me you were the only one who understood him, Eli's mother," then closed the notebook and set it back. Jake watched all of this with quiet respect. "Does it ever get too heavy?" Keanu nodded slowly. "Yeah, but carrying truth is better than running from pain." He stood again and walked back to the hose, picking it up and resuming his watering. He moved plant to plant with calm, deliberate care, like each one had a story, and he was honoring it. Behind him, Jake said, "You know, people still think you're a mystery." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's only because they're asking the wrong questions." "Like what?" "Maybe ask where I go. They should ask why I stay." Jake grinned. "And why do you stay?" Keanu turned the hose off again and faced him. "Because presence is louder than fame." They stood there, two men in the quiet green of morning, not needing to fill the space with anything more. Later that afternoon, Keanu sat alone on the garden bench. The box of letters remained under the tree, its lid cracked slightly open, like an invitation. He didn't need to read all the letters to know what they carried. The themes were always the same: loneliness, pain, the weight of being unseen, but also moments of stillness, glimpses of healing, people daring to write their truth, even if no one responded. He thought of Sarah, of Eli, of the thousands of Elis who hadn't left notes, who hadn't been able to say thank you, or goodbye, or "I'm tired." And he thought of all the times in his own life when silence was the only thing that kept him standing. His partner, his daughter, the empty apartments, the hollow fame. He'd been told to move on, to speak up, to stay strong. But he had learned something else, that some things aren't meant to be spoken. Some things are meant to be sat with. And if he could offer anything to the world, it wasn't a performance. It was that quiet, that space, that stillness that says, "You're not alone. You don't need to impress me. You're enough right here." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting gold over the garden, Keanu closed his eyes. A soft smile settled on his face. His purpose wasn't louder now. It was deeper. And that was enough. The invitation had come in a plain envelope. No official seal, no PR team involved. Just a handwritten note from a fifth-grade teacher in Santa Clarita named Ms. Delaney, and read, "Our students watched your interview. They had questions. Would you be willing to come by, not to inspire, just to be real?" Keanu didn't hesitate. He called the school himself. No entourage, no publicist. Just a quiet arrival on a Tuesday morning. The school didn't prepare a big welcome. There were no posters or staged cameras. Just a row of chairs in a small multi-purpose room, and 28 curious young faces. Keanu walked in wearing jeans, a soft button-up, and the same boots he'd had for years. He smiled, then sat down with the kids instead of taking the adult chair. The students didn't scream. They didn't rush him. They simply leaned forward like they already sensed this wasn't going to be a performance. Miss Delaney started with an easy question. "Do you remember being 10? Keanu nodded. "I remember feeling things I didn't know how to say." A few kids giggled softly. One boy near the back raised his hand. Keanu looked at him gently. "Yeah?" The boy stood to speak, not out of nervousness but respect. "How do you stay soft in a hard world?" The room went silent. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy, not through him, not above him, but into him. Then he knelt on one knee so their eyes were level. By remembering, we're not alone asking that. The boy blinked, surprised by the answer, then slowly nodded. Another student, a girl with thick glasses and a sketch pad in her lap, raised her hand next. "Do you ever cry, even when people are watching?" Keanu gave her a small smile. "Sometimes crying because they're watching is how we remind them they can cry too. There were no grand speeches, no career stories, no Hollywood tales. Keanu didn't talk about fame or movies or tragedy. He talked about questions, how some stay with you for years, how not knowing can be a kind of strength. A student asked, "What if people think you're weird for being quiet?" Keanu replied, "Quiet doesn't mean empty. It just means you're listening longer." By the end of the session, no one had asked for a selfie. No one had begged for autographs. Instead, when the bell rang, a few students lingered just to say thank you. One girl, the one with the journal, slipped her notebook back into her backpack without a word. But later that night, in her room, she would write something she'd never written before. "Hill didn't save me. He reminded me I was worth saving." Back at the school, Ms. Delaney thanked Keanu quietly at the door. "I don't know what you did," she said, "but I've never seen them listen like that." Keanu nodded with humility. Maybe they just heard themselves. That evening, back in Los Angeles, Ellen sat alone in her home office. She had avoided it for weeks. The original interview, the clip that started it all. Now she played it again. She watched herself laughing, teasing, filling space with words that didn't mean what she thought they did. Spencer watched him, his stillness, his grace, the quiet that felt like a mirror. And for the first time, not as a host, not as a brand, but as a person, Ellen began to cry. Ellen paused the video. A reflection hovered faintly in the black screen. Older now, less armored. She sat back in her chair, arms folded tightly across her chest, but her fingers trembled. For so long, her work had been a rhythm. Cue the laugh, time the applause, insert the dance. It hadn't started that way. She remembered her first few shows, back when she still doubted the cameras were even for her, when making someone feel seen meant more than being seen herself. But somewhere along the way, it changed. She had started to perform kindness instead of practicing it, and Keanu hadn't said anything cruel, hadn't corrected her, hadn't defended himself. He just was. That was what shook her the most. Not silence as resistance, but silence as truth. She clicked play again, let the clip run through. This time, she didn't watch herself. She watched the audience, how they shifted, how their smiles faded into stillness, how someone in the third row wiped their eyes when Keanu spoke about silence and survival. Ellen closed the laptop. She didn't need to read comments or follow-up articles. She didn't need feedback. She'd already heard everything she needed to. The next morning, her team noticed the shift before she said a word. She walked into the studio holding nothing but a thermos and a paperback poetry book. No monologue rehearsals, no costume checks. "Cancel the cold open," she said softly. "Just bring in the chairs." The producers exchanged glances but followed her lead. They knew better now. Meanwhile, Keanu was already back at his garden. Later that afternoon, he received a letter in the same box as all the others. This one, however, had no return address. It wasn't long. Just a folded page with a single line, written in thick, deliberate pen. "I saw you before I heard you. Thank you for not raising your voice to be noticed." Keanu didn't smile immediately. He just held the letter for a while, then added it gently to the others beneath the maple tree. He knew it was from Ellen. He didn't need her name on it. The truth had its own handwriting. Back at the Santa Clarita School, the students in Ms. Delaney's class had started a new tradition. Every Friday, instead of story time, they shared what they called soft thoughts. It wasn't about problems or grades or even feelings exactly. It was about naming the parts of themselves they usually kept quiet. One boy admitted he missed his brother who moved out last year. Another girl said she didn't like loud places because they made her chest feel tight. No one laughed. No one teased. They just listened. And in a world that often demanded they be louder, funnier, faster, they began to understand what Keanu meant. Presence isn't earned by noise. It's given through stillness. And somewhere in a small notebook beside a wooden box under a maple tree, Keanu scribbled 3 words after that visit: planting soft seeds. Because not every revolution looks like a protest. Sometimes it looks like 28 kids in folding chairs learning how to listen. The stage looked almost unfamiliar. No spotlight, no house band, no monitor buzzing with countdown timers. Just Ellen, alone, sitting on the edge of the same couch that had for years cradled every celebrity and punchline and perfectly timed applause. The audience was still there, but no one was prompted to clap. No lights flashed, no music played. She folded her hands in her lap and looked directly into the camera. "There's something I used to say all the time," she began, her voice steady but low. "Be kind." She paused. "I said it so often it stopped meaning anything." A long silence followed. This one wasn't awkward. It was clean, like air before a storm clears. "I thought kindness was about keeping everyone comfortable," she continued, "making people laugh, distracting them from the hard stuff." Another pause. "But distraction isn't the same as comfort, and comfort isn't the same as truth." She exhaled slowly. "So today, I don't want to distract you. I want to leave you with something stronger than laughter." Her eyes softened, her voice cracking just slightly. "You don't have to fill every silence. You don't have to smile through every ache. And you don't have to prove your worth by making others clap." She stood up. The camera followed. "I'm learning that the hardest thing in the world is to simply be. And to let others be too." She stepped toward the edge of the stage, where no floor mark waited, no pre-lit cue. "I don't know what comes next for me, but I know what I want to bring with me." Her fingers trembled slightly at her sides. Stillness. Listening. Space. And then, simply, "Thank you." The screen faded to black. No credits rolled. Just a single line in white lettering. "Let the silence speak." In another part of the city, Keanu Reeves walked into a used bookstore tucked between a nail salon and a hardware shop. No one stopped him. No one gasped. He moved quietly, running his hand along the spines of poetry books, stopping to reread a few lines he'd already memorized years ago. Toward the back, a young woman poured coffee behind a tiny built-in espresso bar. She wore glasses, a linen apron, and earbuds that weren't connected to anything. He smiled at her. She smiled back. He took his coffee and moved to a table by the window. Outside, a stranger struggled with the leash of an old golden retriever who had stubbornly refused to leave the sun patch on the sidewalk. Keanu stepped outside, crouched beside the dog, and gently stroked behind its ear. The dog leaned into him. The owner smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Keanu didn't say anything. He just stayed there a moment longer, present, fully, then stood up, nodded, and walked back into the store. Later that afternoon, a young man would post a photo of Keanu crouched beside the dog, adding only the caption, "Made the moment whole." He made the moment whole. The post wouldn't go viral, but it would be saved quietly in a folder titled, "Things That Matter." A week later, a student in Chicago sat in the back of a crowded city bus, earbuds in, watching a clip of Ellen's final show. She wasn't crying, but she wasn't pretending to be fine either. The screen lit her face softly, and when the clip ended, she didn't hit replay. She just sat, still, breathing, remembering that she didn't always need to be performing for the world. On the other side of the country, a father finally replied to a text his daughter had sent 3 weeks ago, the one she thought he ignored. His message was only 4 words. "I'm ready to listen." No emojis, no punctuation, just enough. In a late-night diner in New York, a waitress scribbled something on her order pad between tables, a few lines of poetry. She didn't know why. She just needed to get it out. None of them knew each other, but they were all touched by the same thread. Not fame, not controversy, not spectacle. Stillness, a presence that asked nothing. A space that invited everything. In that space, They found parts of themselves that had been buried under noise. That's what Keanu had offered, without a campaign or a speech. That's what Ellen had learned without a script. And that's what lingered long after the headlines faded. A reminder that the most meaningful moments don't come with applause. They come in the spaces where applause has ended. At a small cafe in Vancouver, a woman read a handwritten note left on her table beside her coffee. It wasn't signed. It said, "You don't need to be loud to matter, just here." She folded the paper and tucked it into her wallet, next to an old photo of her brother. He'd been gone 8 years. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like he was listening again. Later that evening, Keanu walked along a quiet street. The air was cool. His hands were in his coat pockets. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular. A boy on a skateboard nearly clipped him while turning the corner. Keanu stepped back just in time. The boy looked back, startled. "Sorry, man." Keanu smiled. "It's all good." Then something strange happened. The boy stopped, turned around, and rode back. He hesitated before asking, "Can I ask you something?" Keanu nodded. "How do you do it? Stay calm when the world's a mess?" Keanu thought for a second. "I let it be a mess. I just try not to add to it." The boy blinked, then smiled. "Cool." And that was it. No lesson, no headline. Just a quiet moment that mattered. A pause in the noise. And sometimes, a pause is the only honest thing we have. If this incredible story touched you, share it with someone who might be pretending they're okay. You never know what one silent act can mean. And tell us in the comments. When was the last time you allowed yourself to be real? We'll be listening. Always.